Is God dead? That's supposed to be a serious moment to start my talk off. I'm just joking. Is God dead? So the room became quiet as it heard the deep, booming voice of Sojourner Truth ask these words from her seat in the audience as she interrupted the great orator and speaker, Frederick Douglass. He had been speaking on the horrors of slavery and had, in one of his more pessimistic moments, concluded that there could never be an end to the bondage of black men and women without a violent and bloody slave revolt. Sojourner Truth, ever trusting in her sovereign God, could not hold it in. She had to speak up, and from the audience, she simply said, "Frederick, is God dead?" And that's all she had to say. After recovering from the shock of interruption, the audience erupted in applause, and the despair that had just been in the room was swept away. And Sojourner became so known for this quote that years later, when she passed away, those three words were on her tombstone. Is God dead? Good afternoon to you all. It is honestly a privilege to be here today. For those of you who don't know me, like Brian said, my name is Joel McCarty, and I serve as one of the pastors at New Eden Church. As well, the most important thing is that I'm simply a follower of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus of Nazareth. My wife and I have been married almost 11 years. Coming up next month, we have 4 wonderful kids that we enjoy. And I'm just thankful for both of you men putting on this conference. They said they needed a token white speaker. And so I signed up and said, I can do that for you. So they said I could make that joke. Half of you laughed, half of you didn't. It's okay. You can laugh. It's all right. We're relaxed. So I think this is an important work, though. I think truth-telling, not only in our churches, but in our area and into the world, is a very important endeavor. And I'm thankful that this conference seeks to do that. Super important, and I'm excited to be here. So in our session, the second session of this conference, we're looking at a woman named Sojourner Truth. Now, most of Sojourner's life was lived in the 1800s. She is this incredible black Christian woman. She was born into slavery, but eventually, years later, she became an amazing orator, an abolitionist, and a women's rights advocate. Now, a lot of people don't know this about Sojourner, but she remained illiterate her entire life, which makes her public speaking career all that more amazing. She would travel the world and educate on the evils of slavery and the equality that was owed both black men and women in general in America. The thing that a lot of people remember about her was her booming voice, and they say she was 6 feet tall and she had this physique. She would swear that she would do as much as any man in the fields if she put her next to him. She could command a room among even the most influential men of her time. She stood with presidents and leaders. But her life did not start as you might expect. Only by God's good grace and her perseverance would she ever end up with the influence that she carried. This is a little different than normally when I speak. I like to give a bunch of application and stuff, but today I'm going to try to just let her story stand on its own. She was born into slavery in New York in approximately 1797. Her given name to her at birth was Isabella Baumfree. Her parents affectionately called her Belle, and so that's how I will refer to her until we get to the part of her life where her name changed. In her autobiography, she calls her mother, who was Elizabeth, she called her Mama Bet. She was one of around 10 to 12 brothers or sisters. She didn't know exactly because most of them were sold into slavery before she ever even met them. But Mama Bet, she would try to keep their memories alive. She would share the stories of how her brothers and sisters were sold away into slavery to keep their memories alive and also to prepare Belle for what would most likely be her fate one day as well. And this was the life that Belle was born into. In the midst of this, Mama Bet would always tell Belle, at any point, you can pray to God. And she would take her outside and she would show her the moon and she would show her the stars and she would say, that's the same moon and those are the same stars that your brothers and sisters are looking on tonight. And Belle would remember this when she was sold away in the year 1806 at the young age of 9 years old, along with a herd of sheep to make it more attractive for about $100. Throughout the next few years, she would have a couple different slave owners. Eventually, around the age of 13, she landed with the Dumont family. And that's where she would be for the next 17 years, living the horrific life of a slave, where she was raped, beaten, and tortured repeatedly by her owners. She struggled even in later years to talk about this time in her life because it was too hard to share. A traumatic event that she talks about around the age of 18, she had fell in love with this slave from a neighboring farm named Robert, but they weren't allowed to get together and get married because Robert's owner knew that the kids would not be his. And one day, Robert's owner caught him sneaking over to see Belle, and he was severely beaten almost to death. And Belle would never see him again. And she would later talk about how traumatic that incident was in her life. Not soon after, she would be forced to be married to another enslaved man named Thomas by her owner. In her autobiography, she calls these marriages, these slave marriages, a farce, a mockery of marriage, because at any moment on the whim or the interest of the master, the wedding could be annulled, the marriage could be annulled, and as had already happened twice with Thomas, he had been married to 2 other women who were taken away from him. Belle had about 5 kids during this time. We're not sure how many were the result of her relationship with Thomas and how many were the result of being raped by her master. And these are just a few of the things that she endured. Eventually, New York began passing laws that made for the emancipation of slaves, though it was this gradual freedom, and so they had to get to a certain age, and Belle was coming up to be released in the summer of 1827, and her master, the ever-benevolent master, said, "Hey, I'll let you go a year early if you behave." And that was sarcasm if you didn't catch it. As was often the case, when the time came for the Master Dumont to let her go in 1826, he went back on his promise, as often happened, as owners would dangle stuff in front of their slaves to try to keep them doing their job. So at this point, Belle took matters into her own hands. She asked God, "When do you want me to leave?" And she tells this story. And she says, "God told me to leave at dawn because I knew I couldn't leave at night because I couldn't see where I was going and I couldn't leave in broad daylight." And so she took her youngest daughter and everything else she could, and at dawn she left and simply walked out. She said, "I didn't think it was sin because I just walked out. I didn't even run." She ends up at the house of a family, the name of Van Wagoners. And this family took her in, and it was the first white family who treated her with dignity and respect. They even went so far as to buy her and her daughter's freedom. The Dumonts came looking for her, and they tried to take her back to their farm, and the Van Wagoners bought her and her child from the Dumonts. And she recounts as Mr. Van Wagner turned to Belle while Mr. Dumont was still within earshot and said, "Do not call me master, because there is but one master. And he who is your master is also my master." Belle continued to live there for some time, working for the Van Wagoners as a free woman, earning her stay there. During this time, there was one significant event that happened in her life. Her young son, Peter, who was still the property of the Dumonts, he was sold out of state and shipped off to Alabama. This was illegal in New York at the time. And so with the help of some of her Quaker friends, she takes their owners to court and wins this incredible case against the slave owners of her son. This was unheard of during this time. She stood her ground. Even though she won the case, it took months. And the young boy Peter came back from his time in Alabama with horrific scars on his back. He would tell of lying and falling asleep on the wood floor after being beaten, and his flesh sticking to the floor, and he couldn't even get up. At 5 years old. And his mom, Belle, believed that he never fully recovered from these experiences. throughout all these times, the common theme in Belle's life was that she would talk to God intimately. She would say, "Do you think that's all right, God?" When she would see injustice happen, and I love her honesty. We see that in the Psalms. "Do you think that's okay? God, are you all right with that?" And her pursuit of the presence of God in her life and her pursuit of truth were two common themes in her life. Years later, she would write of her time at the Van Wageners, and she had a conversion experience that took place during this time. This is what she said in her book when she had it transcribed years later. "About a year previous to my emancipation, I ran away from my master and went to live with Mr. Wagner. It was here that a change first came over my heart, and I felt that I was a sinner. I prayed to God, and he answered my prayers, and I have experienced his blessings. I said, I really believe I am a sinner, and that Jesus died for me." So in 1829, after staying with the Van Wageners for a bit, so around the age of 34, she would move to New York City and take her youngest child she had escaped with, as well as Peter, and she would kind of earn her way by working in homes and various things. And during this time, she continued her pursuit of truth. She actually got caught up with this weird cult for like a few years, which was interesting in her life. She would later call this a great delusion as she became more grounded in Orthodox Christian doctrine, but escaping and just looking for some kind of sense and belonging, she landed there. And I love that she shares about this in her autobiography because, we take these heroes of the past and we see these caricatures as if they never had struggles or they never walked through difficult things, and that's not reality. They were humans like we were, and it shows us her humanness, but it also shows the faithfulness of God through the most difficult times. And that her pursuit of truth in the end won out. She continued to grow, and her truth went from being only personal, and that happened first. It started there, but it didn't remain there. It went out to where she began to speak out on behalf of others as a result of her searching the scriptures and being led by the Spirit of God. Now remember, she was illiterate. She couldn't just go pick up the Bible and read, so she would have others read passages to her over and over. And she said that I didn't like adults reading it because they always like to add their own commentary and what they thought about it. So she said, just give me kids. Kids will just read the text over and over and not get tired, and she would just listen to kids read the Bible and hear it for herself. And in 1843, around the age of 46, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, which is what she was known as for the rest of her life. Recounting the change, this is what she said. "My name was Isabella, but when I left the house of bondage, I left everything behind. I wasn't going to keep nothing of Egypt on me, and so I went to the Lord and asked him to give me a new name. And the Lord gave me Sojourner, because I was to travel up and down the land, showing the people their sins and being a sign unto them. Afterward, I told the Lord I wanted another name because everybody else has two names. And the Lord gave me Truth because I was to declare truth to the people." And it was around this time that she began her more public ministry, where she began to travel the country up and down, teaching about the rights of both slaves and women. And most of what we know up to this point in her life comes from her autobiography called The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. Due to her inability to read or write, she dictated this, and so much of it's written in the third person. But she dictated the work, and someone wrote down her story, and in 1850, she publishes this book. And then later in 1878, she would add what she called her Book of Life, which was a scrapbook where she kept clippings and signatures and letters that had been written to her, and so we get a lot from her public ministry from that book as well. And much of her life in the public sphere is well documented. She was an amazing personality. I mean, maybe one of those love-hate people, I don't know. You read some articles and they don't like it because of what she's talking about, but she was just a bold personality. There's some crazy stories. In 1851, the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, she spoke at this, and this is where one of her most famous speeches is from. Maybe this is one that you heard, growing up as a kid. It's called "Aren't I a Woman?" Now, historians have proven most of the speech to be historically false, though the main points of that speech still remain. Someone took it and twisted it. But she would tell of how she could work in the fields all day with any man and how women deserved the same rights as the men, the right to vote specifically. Now, there's one story of her in 1858 that I personally love. I hope it's all right to share. It's a little crude, so kids, I don't know, you're going to have to just see it, but I think it's hilarious, okay? So she's speaking to this crowd, and there's a bunch of men there that have started spreading this rumor that she's actually a man who's disguised as a woman. And so they say, we're going to take a vote and see. And everybody voted. All these men said they thought she was a man, and they said she would have to go show her breast to a committee of women before she could continue speaking and prove that she was a woman. So Sojourner, to prove her point, there in front of everyone in a packed house, tore off the top part of her dress and revealed her breast to everyone. And this is what she said. I love this. She said, my breasts have suckled many a white... I was wondering what the guy who had put the slides in was thinking about the slide earlier with no context. But this is what she said. My breasts have suckled many a white baby when they should have been suckling my own. Some of those white babies is now grown men, and even though they have suckled my Negro breasts, they are far more manly than any of you. I show my breasts to the whole congregation, and it ain't my shame, but yours that I should do this. Here then, see for yourselves. And went on with her speech. So that's one way to deal with it. You can imagine the mark that this left on those in attendance and how word got around, right? After one meeting, this man came up to her and said, old woman, do you think your talk about slavery does any good? Do you suppose people care what you say? I don't care any more for your talk than I do for the bite of a flea. To which Sojourner replied, perhaps not, but the Lord willing, I'll keep you scratching. And that's exactly what she did. As she traveled, she would sell these photographs of herself. I think we have a picture of one. And it says at the bottom, you can't probably read it, but it says, I sell the shadow to support the substance. And she would just sell these photographs. And for her, that was just a way to take care of herself as she told this story. The substance for her was her being, her humanness, her dignity, and her message. And even in the face of much opposition, she stubbornly believed that her work mattered and that someday there could be freedom for all. And this, for her, came from not just because she thought she was a great person, but because she served a great God, and she believed that God intimately saw and cared about her people, and that he was behind her in her work. She was relentless about sharing the good news of her Savior, Jesus. At one meeting, she met this celebrated preacher, Dr. Beecher, and she tells of how that meeting went in her book. Here's the excerpt from the book. Sojourner, this is Dr. Beecher. He is a very celebrated preacher. Is he? She said, offering her hand in a condescending manner and looking down on his white head. Ye dear lamb, I'm glad to see ye. The Lord bless ye. I loves preachers. I'm a kind of preacher myself. You are, said Dr. Beecher. Do you preach from the Bible? No, honey, can't preach from the Bible, can't read a letter. Why, Sojourner, what do you preach from then? Her answer was given with a solemn power of voice peculiar to herself that hushed everyone in the room. When I preaches, I has just one text to preach from, and I always preaches from this one. My text is, when I found Jesus. And this is the message of hope she took wherever she went. And it wasn't just words for her. She put action behind her message. She recruited black troops for the Union Army during the Civil War. She would later meet with President Abraham Lincoln at the White House, and she would advocate for her people. And her humor and her strength captivated many, caused them to take to heart what she had to say and listen. And this was Sojourner. Honest, passionate, bold, courageous, even in the face of immense suffering and pain. And she leaves for us a legacy, not only for our country, but also for us as Jesus followers, as followers of this man from Nazareth who came and spoke out on behalf of the hurting and the broken and the poor, for Christians all around the world. In 1883, at the old age of 86, she died. If any of you are 86, I apologize. At that age, she died. I called it old, sorry. It is old, 86 years old. She died in peace with two of her daughters who had cared for her in the last days of her life. A pastor named Reed Stewart spoke at her funeral. This is what he said. And with the poet we could say, calmly, calmly lay her down. She hath fought a noble fight. She hath battled for the right. She hath won the fadeless crown. Hoping, trusting, lay her down. Many in the realms above look for her with eyes of love, breathing her immortal crown. As I was studying and learning this woman beyond just kind of the small snapshots that we see, I was encouraged and exhorted by the legacy she left, by her faith in the presence of God in her life. God was real, active, and alive, and you could not tell Sojourner Truth any different. She was honest with God about where she was and about the plight of her nation and her people, and this led her to a relentless pursuit of truth, both in her own life, personally, and corporately in the public sphere around her. Justice mattered to her because it mattered to her God. She is famously quoted as saying, "The truth is powerful and will prevail." And prevail it did. It prevailed in her own life through the twisting of scriptures by other men, first to enslave her, and then later to try to spiritually manipulate her. In the end, her pursuit of truth won out. And it won out in the world around her as she spoke truth and just let it do its work. From the life of Sojourner, we learn that the pursuit of truth and justice matters because it has divine backing. She never thought she was alone in her pursuit. And by God's grace, neither are we. She wrote this hymn that she would sing in her baritone voice, that she would break out into song at times, and she speaks out for her fellow man while holding forth the hope of the gospel. She says, "I am pleading for my people, a poor, downtrodden race, who dwell in freedom's boasted land with no abiding place. I am pleading that my people may have their rights restored, for they have long been toiling and yet had no reward. They are forced the crops to culture, but not for them to yield. Although both late and early they labor in the field. Whilst I bear upon my body the scars of many a gash, I am pleading for my people who groan beneath the lash. I am pleading for the mothers who gaze in wild despair upon the hated auction block and see their children there. I feel for those in bondage. Well, may I feel for them. I know how fiendish hearts can be that sell their fellow men." And listen to this grace. "Yet those oppressors steeped in guilt, I still would have them live, for I have learned of Jesus to suffer and forgive. I want no carnal weapons, no enginery of death, for I love not to hear the sound of war's tempestuous breath. I do not ask you to engage in death and bloody strife. I do not dare insult my God by asking for their life. But while your kindest sympathies to foreign lands do roam," I'm going to speak to my white brothers in here because this is applicable to us, "I would ask you to remember your own oppressed at home." It is a both and, as we talked about a moment ago. "I plead with you to sympathize with sighs and groans and scars, and note how base the tyranny beneath the stripes and stars." And her words, even to this day, speak to our context. As we look around the world and see injustice in our communities and in our country and around the world, and we are tempted to simply ignore the realities of those brokenness because they're too big to bear, so we just set them to the side and go on with our comfortable lives. And so we have to go back to the question we asked at the beginning: is God dead? Because the answer to that question determines how you live. if God in fact is dead, if God in fact is distant and uninvolved, if he in fact does not exist, then all of our labors for justice and equity are absolutely in vain. If God is dead, then our efforts for kingdom expansion and gospel movement are empty. If God is dead, I'll be real with you. As the Apostle Paul said, we're wasting our lives, and we are of all men most to be miserable and most to be pitied. If God is dead, then you should go eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. If God is dead, then you should get what you can while you can for you and yours, using whatever power or violent force you have to. If this is all there is, if God is dead, then we need not listen to the cries of the oppressed among us. If God is dead, then we can pick and choose which humans we value based on whatever metrics we want. If God is dead, then yours and my life should be spent in the pursuit of pleasure and comfort, getting whatever we can instead of the pursuit of truth, because that's a very costly pursuit. But if, as Sojourner Truth believed with every fiber of her being, if God is alive, if Jesus really did die for the sins of the cosmos, for the world, for all people, if Jesus really did defeat the enemy, if he really did promise to come back and put all things to right and make all things new, if he did get back up out of the grave on the third day, if this is true, then that means that God is alive, and if that is true, it changes everything. If God is alive, then there is incredible value in our long march toward justice. If God is alive, then every human being has value and worth simply because God created them in his image. If God is alive, then there is hope in the dark night of suffering. If God is alive, then there is a power that is greater than any of us that will finish the work that he started on the cross when he stamps out the powers of injustice and darkness. And he embarrasses the powers of darkness for the whole world to see. If it's really true that he breathes on his church the Spirit, as the Father hath sent me into the world, so now send I you, and he breathes on us the Spirit and says, go. If it's true that the church has been given to the world as the primary means of restoration, if this is true, we'll never take a back seat. We'll never just say that it's about the sweet by and by, because the kingdom has burst forth into the present and it matters now. If God is alive, then those who are his kingdom citizens will lead the way in the world with grace, humility, boldness, enemy love, and unity. Only by the power of the Spirit, displaying to the world this glorious eternal way that is rooted in the good news of the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It's what we have. So whoever you are, if you are in Christ, be encouraged. And if you're not, may I invite you to repent and believe the good news of the gospel. Jesus is King and he is Savior. And he is what gives us the perseverance through difficult times. But if you are in Christ, be encouraged. Not because we'll always get it right. Not because we've got it all figured out. But because we serve a God who is at work through his broken bride throughout history. Including a little black slave girl who grew up to become a woman around those of great influence. We can look at her life and we can be encouraged because we serve a God who takes things that seem to be insignificant and meaningless, people who the enemy and other humans try to stamp out, and he turns those lives into stories of glory. In close, I'll read for you one of Sojourner Truth's favorite hymns that she would often sing And I want you to think of her life and her journey and how much these words meant to her. There is a holy city, a world of light above the stairs and regions built by the God of love. An everlasting temple and saints arrayed in white, there serve their great Redeemer and dwell with him in light. The meanest or smallest child of glory outshines the radiant sun. But who can speak the splendor of Jesus on his throne? Is this the man of sorrows who stood at Pilate's bar, condemned by haughty Herod and by his men of war? He seems a mighty conqueror who spoiled the powers below and ransomed many captives from everlasting woe. The host of saints around him proclaim his work of grace, the patriarchs and prophets and all the godly race, who speak of fiery trials and tortures on their way. They came from tribulation to everlasting day. And what shall be my journey? How long I'll stay below? Or what shall be my trials? Are not for me to know. But in every day of trouble, I'll raise my thoughts on high. I'll think of that bright temple and crowns above the sky. Is God dead? Kids, you can say no now. He most certainly is not dead. Thank you.